give you the bug which is actually causing the problem, and we may change the antibiotics accordingly.
Right. So I think another important point is when you do ERCP in patients with cholangitis, regardless of pregnancy, more so in pregnancy, our job is to drain it. Drain means do a sphincterotomy and place a bile stent and come out. If you find that there is a stone which you can easily take it out, best would be to take out this stone. That's an ideal. But if you think it will take long, suggestion is to do sphincterotomy, place a stent or a nasobiliary tube and come out, because biliary drainage is the most important thing that you need to do to achieve in these patients. So now coming back to the risks of ERCP, Dr. Nijaman, you mentioning radiation risk of endoscopy, risk of medications. So what are the risks of endoscopy in patients who is pregnant in second trimester or third trimester?
You see, the risks are the similar ones actually. As we do sphincterotomy in these patients, so there is a possibility of you having a GI bleed, post-sphincterotomy bleed. There may be perforation, there may be pancreatitis. So the complications are similar to what you get in a non-pregnant female.
My point is complications due to endoscopy with regard to pregnancy.
Yeah,
is there a risk of abortion, spontaneous abortion?
In fact, you can do safely the endoscopy. The only issue is like if it is a third trimester, then you have to be a little more. I mean, you can do it in a supine position or a left lateral position, so as not to have a pressure on the uterus. And with the minimal insufflation, you can do your job. But there is no contraindication as far as pregnancy is concerned for the ERCP.
Dr. Jain, as an obstetrician, how are you concerned when we do endoscopy in patients with cholangitis or GI bleed in second and third trimester? First trimester, I know, shouldn't be much of a problem.
Well, when you're doing an endoscopy, there are a few things, as you've already put up, that the sedatives, the analgesics, the antibiotics, and the radiation. Antibiotics we have discussed. Regarding sedatives and analgesics, we are talking about is...
I'm coming to medication. I'm saying when we do endoscopy, are you worried that due to air insufflation, patient may have abortion?
No. There is no contraindication to doing that. No. Okay. The insufflation does not. No, it does not lead to it.
So for us, this is a very important point, because many times when we do endoscopy, we are often concerned whether it will lead to premature labor. And so what you're saying is that if you are careful in an endoscopy procedure, and Dr. Nijaman mentioned that we should insufflate minimal air, then there should not be much of a problem, right? So the next issue is the radiation. So the issues are how much radiation during ERCP is given, how much is safe in pregnancy, and what precaution you take. Dr. Nijaman, I'm bringing you again to tell us about the radiation.
You see, actually it is around 2 to 6 millisievert during 2 to 16 minutes of ERCP. It is actually equivalent to possibly a little less than doing a CT scan. And average exposure, if you take it for non-radiation person, again it is 2 to 3 millisievert. So it's an exposure which can lead to fetal risk. So ideally, we should try and do ERCP with the avoiding the radiation. But again, you need to have a skilled endoscopist, and if you take a use of a percutaneous ultrasound to see for the guide wire, again you need to have a skilled percutaneous sonologist to guide you. Otherwise, you can do safely ERCP with a conventional method with certain points which I want to discuss to actually prevent the amount of exposure, like actually
we'll come to that. Let's go slow here. So you're saying the fluoroscopy time is usually 5 to 10 minutes, ERCP time.
Yeah.
The dose which we deliver during ERCP is 2 to 6 millisievert. Chest X-ray is 0.1. CT scan is 4 to 6. And our average annual human exposure is 2 to 3 millisievert. Yeah. My question to Dr. Jain is, how much you consider is safe during pregnancy? How much radiation is safe because people are worried about just one X-ray also. But there are hard data to say how much is actually safe. So Dr. Jain, what is your take on that?
So the first thing I would like to say is that the dictum stays LRI is the principle as low as reasonably achievable. That we have to remember. Having said that, the effect of radiation on pregnancy depends upon the gestation. It varies with the gestation. In the first 2 weeks after conception, the embryo is pluripotent and it is a all or none law. Like it will either not affect or it will cause abortion. 2 to 8 weeks, that is the time when there is organogenesis. That is when the congenital malformations can occur. And usually after that, there could be mild neurodevelopmental problems. And after about 15 weeks, we do not have too much effect with the radiation. But what you have to remember is that the dose of diagnostic radiographic procedures is far less than what would actually be very harmful to the fetus. So less than 5 rads, which is the usual radiation due to any diagnostic procedure, is rather safe for the baby. More than 10 rads in the first 2 weeks is lethal. 2 to 8 weeks can cause a CMA, congenital malformations. So we are safe with less than 5 rads, and the precaution that has to be taken, we shield the abdomen, and if we are away from the abdomen, the scatter radiation is far less. So this is something one should remember. It is a little overhyped that not even a single X-ray can be done. It is not so. Less than 5 rads is well within the limits of safety, and which is usually the diagnostic procedures do not cross that. But I would agree with Dr. Nijavan, we should keep the time for fluoroscopy to as minimum as possible. But if it is required, I do not think there is anything against doing it.
So the bottom line is that up to 5 millisievert during pregnancy is considered safe. And after 26 weeks or so, and you were saying, in fact, 15 weeks, it doesn't really matter much. Now, in the first trimester, as when we do a ERCP, we are not too worried about radiation because the fetus is still in the pelvis. So our radiation to the fetus is very, very minimal, if any. Now, the only thing we need to be sure when we do ERCP is that our wire is in the bile duct. So we only need fluoro to make sure the wire is in the bile duct, and that doesn't give much radiation. So why I'm emphasizing this point is I've often seen people trying to do ERCP in pregnancy by this method or that method, and trying to go selective into bile duct, then aspirating bile, and they take a lot of time in that. That may cause more problems because you may cause pancreatitis. My suggestion is, once you try and cannulate the bile duct, make sure you're in bile duct by seeing fluoroscopy. The small amount of radiation you're going to give is not going to be harmful, but if you spend too much of time on selective cannulation without fluoro, that would be more harmful. So that's an important point. Now, what precautions should we take, Dr. Nijavan? This is what you were mentioning.
Yeah. Actually, there are a few things which we have to follow. That is minimal of the fluoro time, as you have already said, that you should have a pulse fluoro. I mean, it's not like doing a continuous fluoro. You see the wire and then you stop it. Nowadays, we have wires which have actually, vision under very much control, whether wire is going inside or outside. So once you have you are sure that it is on the right side and is gone into the bile duct, then there is no need to use fluoro if you want to do stenting. Then you actually cover the fetal area with a lead apron, and then you should actually discuss with your radiophysicist before doing a pregnant lady for ERCP, so as to adjust the minimum dose at the fluoroscopy which is required to actually see a wire and the stent which has gone into the position. And maybe the beam which gives the radiation should be actually close enough, and the receptor also should be close enough to the body so that the scattered radiations are not there. This is how actually we can prevent the minimal actually which is radiation which is being given to the mother and the fetus.
So as low as reasonably achievable is the ALARA principle, and as pointed out by Dr. Nijavan, you just have to make sure the wire is in the bile duct, minimal fluoro, you can do that, and there should be no problem with this. Now, coming to the medications, Dr. Jain, we have talked about antibiotics, there are two things which we also need to discuss. One is sedative, the other is analgesics. So patient is having pain. What analgesics would you prefer?
For the analgesics, the safest one is acetaminophen or paracetamol, which has, and we have enough studies to say, and that is our first choice always. And if you're talking of sedatives and analgesics for the the procedural sedation, it is very well established that if a woman requires a procedure, an emergency diagnostic or therapeutic procedure during pregnancy, which is likely to cause pain, she should definitely be given a procedural sedation, and it does not harm the fetus. Mainly because we are giving a very low dose and we are giving it for a short time. What is more important is that the women, pregnant women, because of the change in physiology, are very prone to hypoxia, hypercarbia, and hypotension. These are the things which we should be more careful about, that they should be avoided when we are doing any procedure. The woman should be always in a left lateral tilt so that the weight of the uterus is taken off the IVC and there is no supine hypotension. As long as we are able to take care of hypoxia and hypotension, any of the sedatives or analgesics can be given. Regarding the category that you have shown, yes, the category used to be, FDA categories were used, and it was a simple way of talking of the risk versus benefit. But these categories now have been taken off, and they have been now replaced by the principles, the pregnancy and lactation labeling rules, the PLLRs, which gives the exact risk and benefit for each drug. We do not now go by the FDA BCD categories, because it was too generalized.
What sedatives would you say we can use during ERCP?
We can use, there is nothing against using benzodiazepines. They were thought to cause cleft lip, cleft palate given in the first trimester, but that the dose we give in the for these procedures does not cause any harm and does not lead to any malformation. So
how about propofol, midazolam, and fentanyl? These are the ones we
propofol is also safe. Yes, the propofol is also safe to be given. It is given as a procedural sedative for any procedure that is required during pregnancy, and it is safe. Even midazolam, a small dose that we are giving for that procedure is safe, as long as we see to it that we are giving 100% oxygen along with, so that there is no hypoxia and we keep the patient tilted and there is no hypotension. If hypotension occurs, that should be taken care of. These are the things which are more important.
Dr. Pramod, I may have to interrupt you here. I think we will have to wind up the session quickly. So if you can just focus on the key aspects, and we have a surgeon on site here as a chairperson, so you can address that question to him also.
So, but you have taken into account the interruption of 5 minutes in between.
I'm sorry, I understand, but we have to still stay in time.
This is the last issue we are going to discuss, and thankfully a surgeon is with us. So when do we do cholecystectomy in a pregnant lady who has a stone, and Dr. Nijavan has taken care of the CBD stone by putting in a stent, and antibiotics has been given, she improves. Do we do cholecystectomy, when and how?
So, sir, the index case was in cholangitis. So definitely when we did a stunt, we have taken care of the cholangitis, but it takes some time to resolve the infection. So at least we will, after stunting, we have to wait for some time, maybe 2 weeks to 3 weeks. Then after that, cholecystectomy can be done at any time.
So would you like to wait till pregnancy is over, or you like to do cholecystectomy after 2, 3, 4 weeks?
No, I think the risk of having the complication due to gallstones is much higher than the risk of cholecystectomy. So we should go with the cholecystectomy.
So this is one study which showed high recurrence of symptoms during pregnancy, and that is why they say that we should go in early and do cholecystectomy, because delay in surgical management may lead to other problems, including obstetric problems, spontaneous abortion, and preterm labor. So just finishing now, gallstones are quite common in pregnant females, 2 to 11%, and this is due to the effect of both estrogen and progesterone, which lead to increased cholesterol, decreased bile acids, and hypomotility of gallbladder. CVD stones are seen in about 10% of patients with gallbladder stones. ERCP, as we discussed, is safe and effective. They're not very large series, but yeah, some series are available. And lap cholecystectomy is safe, and conservative treatment may lead to recurrence of symptoms. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude by saying cholangitis is a potentially fatal condition, must be recognized early. The treatment is drainage and antibiotics, but drainage is the key to success here. And ERCP is most rewarding in patients with acute cholangitis. And management in pregnancy is by and large similar to that in non-pregnant females. Thank you all very much for your kind attention, and happy to take if there is any urgent question. Otherwise, we can wind up the session. As Dr. Datta said, we are already running.
Yeah, we'll just take two questions which have come. One is on any thoughts on cholangioscopy guided or EUS guided procedure in pregnancy to avoid radiation. What are your quick thoughts?
I think the session should dispel any notion about radiation risk. I would say don't try and do something which you are not doing regularly, cholangioscopic or EUS, don't do anything. Just go ahead and do ERCP as you do in other patients. Little bit of radiation has no effect. Dr. Jain has very categorically said 5 millisievert is the safest limit. We don't give even 1/10 of that.
Okay, so the message to the residents is go ahead, do a quick ERCP, minimize use of fluoroscopy, use a shield and do a safe ERCP as quick as possible. And it's better for a consultant to do in such a situation so that the chances of ERCP time exposure is reduced.
So
yeah, Dr. Harjeet, is there any other question?
Just 1 minute. Quick, when you have to drain the system, and don't wait to clear the bile duct. But when you have to cannulate, take your time and cannulate well, rather than quickly trying to cannulate. That may cause more problem.
Okay.
Two more questions from the floor. One was because plastic stent need to replace after 3 months. So what to do with these stents in pregnancy? Suppose the stenting was done at first trimester or early second trimester.
Dr. Nijaman will take that.
Yeah, actually, if the patient remains asymptomatic during pregnancy, continue with that plastic stent. But if patient gets a recurrence of symptoms of cholangitis, you can do exchange of the stent, which is very quick.
Okay.
So
one more question. There is no cholangitis.
If cholecystectomy has been done, you have cleared the bile duct, you can safely take out the stent as well. But if for some reason you have to keep the stent, there's no problem.
Now, another question is there is no cholangitis, but CBD stone is detected during pregnancy.
Now, depends. If the LFT is absolutely normal, one can wait for a while. But in most cases, you will find the LFT is abnormal. And then I think it would be best to do ERCP and clear the bile duct, because you don't know whether the stone will cause problem in later course of the pregnancy. But the decision should be taken in consultation with the obstetrician and the patients.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Garg, for an excellent discussion on this very difficult topic in which it is a multidisciplinary approach. I would pass it on to Dr. Atul Sachdeva for giving his concluding remarks.
Yeah, I think it is.
So you're not audible.
No, am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. In fact, I just wanted to ask one question to Pramod about the cautery, basically. You see, there was some doubt about what is the best current to use. Is it harmful to the fetus in any way? And any recommendations or any thoughts about that?
No concern nowadays. I mean, you can use
no concern at all. Because there was some data to show that don't have the foot plate. In fact, put it in the upper part of the body so that the current actually just transmits out rather than put a plate close to the foot. So I guess those concerns are probably unfounded. So I'm not very sure about that.
You're right.
Well, I guess thank you very much. It was a wonderful session and very nice and very nicely covered. You have covered all the aspects related to the occurrence of cholangitis in a young pregnant woman. I guess we need to move on to the next session, which is to be again another symposium.
Thank you, Dr. Jain and Dr. Brooke.
Yeah, I guess thank you very much, and we need to start the next session. Maybe Dr. Usha, you can introduce the panelists and the speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sachdeva. The next session is on cholestasis in pregnant lady. This session will be conducted by Dr. Eapen. He's a professor at the CMC Vellore Hospital. And thank you, Dr. Eapen, for joining in. And here we have three panelists. Dr. Vanita Suri, she's a professor and head in the Department of Gynecology and Obstetrics. We have Dr. Madhumita Prem Kumar, who's an associate professor in the Department of Hepatology. She's joining us virtually. And we have Dr. Pankaj Kumar, who's a post-DM senior resident from the Department of Gastroenterology. I request all the three panelists to join us in this session. Over to Dr. Eapen, please.
Thank you, Dr. Usha Datta, and thank you for all the organizers for inviting me to participate. And as in the last two cases being discussed, here again, it's a situation of need for active interaction between the obstetrician as well as the hepatologist or gastroenterologist in looking after a patient with cholestasis in a pregnant lady. Are my slides visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'll present the case and I'll request the panelists to take on the questions as it come along.
So please make it full screen.
Okay. It's full screen now?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is a 29-year-old lady. The story is that during her two pregnancies, she said in the first pregnancy in 2018, in the 7th month, she developed itching, but she did not have jaundice. And in the 8th month, she had there was an intrauterine death. And after delivery, the itching subsided. In 2020, she had a second pregnancy. Again, in the 7th month, she started getting itching, but she did not have jaundice. This time, the pregnancy went up to term, and it was a normal delivery, a live baby was well. After delivery, the itch subsided. However, we did not have any investigation reports available. Now, she, this year, in 2021, has had new problems. About 3 months after the delivery, she started oral contraceptive pills. 1 month after starting the OCPs, she got fever for 3 days. For she took paracetamol and some NSAIDs. And once the 3 days of fever subsided, she started noticing jaundice, yellow eyes and urine. She had developed an itch, along with an itch, and occasional pale stools. By this time, she stopped the oral contraceptive pill. She did not have abdominal pain. She also had, in this 1 month, 8 kg weight loss. So when she got the jaundice, she also took some herbal medications. And on probing, we could find that she's taken earlier similar contraceptive pills for menorrhagia, and that time she had no itching. And once after the first pregnancy, and again she did not have itching. So the first question I would like to request Dr. Vanita Suri to take it on, assuming she's joined us, is how is intrahepatic cholestasis pregnancy diagnosed? And can ICP present without jaundice with only itch? Dr. Vanita, please.
Thank you, Dr. Eapen. Good evening, everybody. Now, this patient had 2 pregnancies and most likely the diagnosis was ICP. Though we don't have complete data, I only have itch. I don't have bile acids and LFT. So the diagnosis, the first symptom is itching or pruritus, but there has to be additional change in the bile acid levels for making a diagnosis of ICP. And normally, this is my slide. So the pruritus starts from mild to intolerable because it starts in the palms and soles and it's worse at night. And 23% of pregnancies have pruritus, but it doesn't mean they all have ICP. So we have to rule out other causes of pruritus. And rare symptoms are right upper quadrant pain, anorexia, nausea, steatorrhea. In jaundice is very, very uncommon. Bilirubin is normally less than 6 milligram because in our experience, we have rarely seen jaundice, even in severe cholestasis. So on examination, we can rule out dermatological conditions. There is no other signs of any dermatological condition. There can be scratch marks only. And jaundice is very rare. So after this, once a patient comes with pruritus, we have to order bile acids. And if bile acids are more than 10 micromole per liter, it means it is cholestasis. Then further we divide it into mild, moderate, and severe. And many times patients come with only LFT reports. Bile acids are not done. And if LFTs are abnormal, there is pruritus. Then I think, because cholestasis is a diagnosis of exclusion. So we have to rule out other liver disorders. So if our suspicion is high towards liver disease, then we should not make a diagnosis of cholestasis, even if pruritus is there. Because if like enzymes are very high in thousands sometimes, then we have to, take hepatologist help and make the diagnosis by doing ultrasound and all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panita. So this patient has had 3 times contraceptive pills. So I would request Dr. Pankaj to talk a bit about that. Is there a link between OCP use and intrahepatic cholesterol pregnancy? And why does ICP present in late pregnancy? Dr. Pankaj.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir, there is certainly a link between the OCP use and intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy. It has been seen that patients with history of OCP-related cholestasis, these patients are more prone to have intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy during the subsequent pregnancy. And also it has been seen that patients with history of intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy are more prone to have OCP-related cholestasis if they use OCP. The common link between two is due to their sharing of common etiopathogenesis, in which there is, in pregnancy, there is increase in the concentration of the sex hormones and their metabolite, mainly the estrogen, which has in vitro effect on the bile acid transport across the canalicular membrane. Estrogen also leads to the decreased expression of hepatic bile acid receptor. And these changes lead to increase in the concentration of the bile acid in the serum, and that leads to the symptoms of intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy. So the use of oral contraceptive pills in patients with past history of intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy should be done with caution, and merit should be given to use of other non-hormonal method of contraception. Coming to the second question.
Okay, please go ahead.
Coming to the second question, why the presentation of intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy is in during the late half of the pregnancy. The usual time of presentation of ICP is at the end of the second trimester or in the initial part of the third trimester. As we know that with increase in the duration of the pregnancy, there is increase in the concentration of the sex hormones and their metabolites, and mainly the estrogen is responsible for impairing the homeostasis of bile acid. And the effect of estrogen is inhibition of bile acid transport across the canalicular membrane, and this leads to increase in the concentration of the bile acid in the serum, and that's the reason the presentation is in the initial third trimester of pregnancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pankaj. I'll move on. I'll request Dr. Vanitha to take on these questions. Why does intrauterine death happen in a patient with ICP? Does ICP pose a risk of maternal mortality? And when should delivery be planned in ICP?
See, the first question, fetal outcome, till now we are not very sure what is the cause. And we don't have even any good method of diagnosing whether fetus is at risk, should be taken out, when and how. So whatever the conjectures are there, most likely the fetal outcome is affected because of it's a sudden death, because there is no fetal growth restriction. So either there's a cardiac arrhythmia due to bile acids, or there's a spasm of placental vessels, which leads to sudden asphyxia and baby dies. And there's a meconium stain fluid, which is very high incidence. This is again due to irritation by bile acids. And because premature delivery is very common, either spontaneous or iatrogenic. Spontaneous is because the myometrial oxytocin receptors are affected by bile acids, so they go into preterm labor. And iatrogenic because we tend to, induce them before term sometimes if it is a severe cholestasis. So therefore, the neonatal outcome is also equally bad. They have NICU admissions and there is RDS, and therefore the outcome is affected. As far as maternal outcome is concerned, that is one good thing about ICP, because if maternal outcome is affected in acute fatty liver of pregnancy. And sometimes I feel, this is a because the body, we have categorized into HELP syndrome, ICP, acute fatty liver. Something happens to the body during pregnancy. This is a chain of events. If it's a benign, we call it ICP. It becomes malignant, we call it AFLP. Because it is some process which is happening under the effect of hormones, which leads to liver damage. So if it's a mild, it is ICP. Here only baby is affected. Mother is not affected. The only thing is chance of increased induction because preterm and increased operative delivery sometimes because of meconium staining of the baby. That can be there. And recurrence is very high. So that's how. But maternal mortality, if it is a pure ICP, is not high. But because of ICP, there is increased incidence of preeclampsia also. So sometimes things are, overlapped. Either it is HELP or preeclampsia or ICP plus preeclampsia, because in the ward, it's very difficult to make the diagnosis, what is there, because so many conditions lead to liver damage. So ICP pure doesn't lead to increased maternal mortality. Timing of delivery, again, different societies have given different intervals. But one thing we have to remember, earlier the cholestasis sets in and more severe it is, the timing has to be very early because the baby is going to get affected. So depending upon the bile acid levels, different recommendations have been given. So if it's mild, after 37 weeks, not going beyond term, but if it's moderate and severe, then we have to deliver even before 37 weeks. And then we have to see other factors. Suppose a patient has bad obstetric history, like she has stillbirth in the previous pregnancy. We won't have a heart to take her beyond that gestation when she had stillbirth. So our decision is not very straightforward. We have to see other obstetric factors, how many children she has, live pregnancies. Accordingly, we have to, decide, but it has to be, we should try to attain 37 weeks. After that, no use waiting once we have achieved that fetal viability. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vanitha. So may I now request Dr. Madhumita to bat this question. Is UDCA, ursodeoxycholic acid, useful to treat ICP? Madhumita, please.
So there's been a lot of new evidence that is now available to treat ICP, including the large pitches trial, the second part of it, which was published just a year ago. So the outcomes that we need to look for in for UDCA are, number one, for the maternal issue, the itching that is there, which is quite disabling in some cases, and the raised transaminases. Then we need to look at the fetal outcomes, whether there's actually any benefit in these trials for fetal outcomes, that is early, sudden stillbirth rate or fetal distress, or the need for interventions. And of course, other secondary outcomes, we need to look at how many were taken up for intervention or not, or whether there was MSL or not. And then, of course, the timing of delivery. So the mechanistic way UDCA would actually act is it's a cholinergic agent. It replaces toxic bile acids by a quaternary stable acid, and it will become 60 to 70% of the total bile. So if we look at the data that is available from the most recent Cochrane systematic review, again, they have stratified on the basis of the level of bile acids, whether it is less than 40, between 40 and 100, and greater than 100. Well, the benefit of UDCA in fetal outcomes is there when the bile acid level is more than 40. Up to 40, it will be useful for reducing the pruritus, and maybe it will help in normalization of the LFT, but it has no beneficial outcomes in changing neonatal outcomes. So the real issue with ICP is the risk to the fetus, and UDCA does not modify that.
Thank you. So this, thank you, Madhumita. So this patient's problem was severe itching, and she was distraught. And so she had, for a month, received UDCA and cholestyramine, and then she was advised liver transplant, and that's when she became even more distraught, and she had come to our institution. This is her investigation when she came to us. Her liver function showed the bilirubin of 26.9, direct of 24, an alkaline phosphatase of 276, normal being less than 125, and a normal GGT. Etiological workup for jaundice for viruses were negative, hepatitis viruses, and autoimmune profile is negative. Ultrasound showed gallstones and a small hemangioma liver, and MRI did not show biliary dilatation. There were no bile duct stones. She underwent a liver biopsy at her hometown. It was reviewed here, the slides. The impression was essentially marked zone 3 canalicular cholestasis. The IHC stain, immunohistochemistry, showed diffuse MDR3 staining in 90%. So I would request Madhumita to opine. What would you think the diagnosis would now be in this patient?
This is a patient who's having two pregnancies with ICP, one of which resulted in a stillbirth, one in a live fetus, one in a live child. And 3 months after this, she's presented with progressive intrahepatic cholestatic jaundice. The MRI and everything is suggestive that there is no extrahepatic biliary obstruction. And there is a temporal association with OCP. Of course, this is her third use, but she has also taken herbal medication. So the points in favor of my first differential is DILI, because ICP would have resolved after her pregnancy. And this is obviously someone with a genetic predisposition to developing cholestasis. And now she's taken a concoction of different medicines, which has resulted in intrahepatic bile damage. So my first differential would definitely be DILI, but there is an unclear temporal association with either of the drugs. So the second differential that I will have to entertain is small duct PSC. Of course, the liver biopsy that has been done from outside is not showing much of changes, except that there is extensive biliary proliferation, ductular proliferation. And my third differential would be a type 4 or type 5 PFIC. The issue here is PFIC type 3 is most common, but in that the GGT is elevated and the MDR3 stain would have been less or it would be defective. So, however, there is PFIC type 4 and type 5 where there is TJP and FXR mutation. So this has been described newly. So this is also a possibility that has to be kept. The last two forms, vanishing bile duct syndrome, is a subset, of course, for DILI in this case. And it has been described in many cases of, and this kind of progression of only isolated conjugated hyperbilirubinemia with largely preserved AST-ALT, normal synthetic function. INR is normal, but ALP is, of course, elevated. So that would be my differential, DILI 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you, Madhumita. Well, so we can discuss about differentials, but this lady is itching. So what are the treatment options that we have in this patient?
So again, sir, the first thing I would give would be UDCA. Like I mentioned before, it is a very useful and safe drug for us to have. And in this patient who's having very high jaundice, of course, there's no synthetic dysfunction. Plasma exchange can also be done. This helps in removing the toxic agents that might be there, improves the nutrition of the patient, because if we remove the bilirubin and some amount of cytokines that are there, the patient's appetite tends to improve. And sometimes the liver regeneration occurs during this time. If nutrition is maintained, the toxic agent is removed and plasma exchange is done. If the pruritus is very significant, we can also go for nasobiliary drainage, which is what we do if the patient is having intractable pruritus. Along with UDCA, we tend to add on steroids. Now, this is of course controversial. It depends on the setting. If there is a lot of synthetic dysfunction, then I would avoid it. I would rather go for plasma exchange. But in this case, a trial of steroids can definitely be offered. And activated charcoal has been described in, but there's not much evidence-based literature available for it. Fat-soluble vitamins have to be given. And yes, the patient has to be counseled that we can wait and watch for about 2 to 3 months. And in case things get better, well and good. Otherwise, the possibility, especially in vanishing bile duct syndrome, they might require transplant in the future.
Thank you, Madhumita. Now, this is the course of treatment in our hospital. So she underwent low volume plasma exchange. I will not, time doesn't permit me to go into discussing high volume, standard volume, and low volume. At our department, we've been focusing on using low volume, and it seems to work very well, I must say. She underwent 3 sessions of plasma exchange, done centrifugal type of plex was done, and each time 1000 ml of plasma was exchanged. In addition, she was given oral activated charcoal, low dose steroid, UDCA, and zinc. And thankfully, she had a pretty dramatic improvement. So as you can see, the table shows the 3 sessions of plasma exchange she had. And by the time the plex was done, her itching started to improve. Though in the next follow-up visit as an outpatient, she's still not a very happy person, because in the back of her mind, liver transplant is hanging in the air. But when she's come after 2 months for follow-up, all is well. She's smiling. So I told her, it sounds like you should avoid contraceptive pill. But she says, no, first 2 times, nothing happened. There was no itch. So she knows I do not know the answer. but her itch improved. So I think we will conclude here, and I'll hand it back to the chairpersons or Usha for any comments.
Yes. How is my sound?
Perfect, sir.
Yeah, I think that was a very nice case discussion, Dr. Eapen. We'll just ask our residents if they have any questions, the postgraduates who are here.
Okay, so
If you have a question, please come to the mic.
Start my video also.
Eapen sir,
Sure.
what
Yes,
was
Dr.
the
Jayendra?
significance of
I can see you now,
Bond-Milbrand factor?
Okay, and I'll share the screen.
Yeah, please do.
I'll be doing in Keynote.
We'll need another symposium to explain it.
Should not be a problem.
However, VWF, we should remember,
Can you see my
is
slides?
the
Yes, I can see your slides
largest
very clearly,
size
I'll run those.
protein or molecule in a normal plasma, the largest size plasma protein. So,
Okay, so you can see
we started focusing on
slide,
this
okay?
when we found
Yeah, I can see.
that
I think
in
you are on
liver
slide
failure,
share. I'm
plasma
looking at
exchange
a
is
full
now
slide.
saving lives.
Ready.
Yes.
And how come in dialysis is not happening?
Perfect, sir.
So,
Perfect.
so it's
Okay,
we could think
Thank
it's a
you.
molecule which is beyond a dialysable limit, which is more than 60 kilodaltons in size. So there'll be many such macromolecules. The biggest one being VWF, and that correlates with death in ALF, ACLF as good as MELD score. So, and we have also demonstrated VWF comes out in the bag of plasma we are throwing away. So it's like ESR. It's one acute phase reactant sort of a situation only, but we think it plays a pathogenic role in liver failure, which this lady did not have. This lady had only cholestasis and inflammation, I think.
Dr. Eapen, I noticed that the ferritin also steadily came down. So do you think that is also a part of the acute phase reactant here?
You will get me going. So this area is reticuloendothelial activation, of which ferritin could be macrophage activation. So as in COVID, we know ferritin is considered the macrophage activation. So if you tie these two together, this is reticuloendothelial. Reticulo is the macrophage, that reticulated cell appearance of the cell under EM, that is ferritin. Raised VWF is the endothelial part of it. So overactive innate immune response, which is what active RE activation is a hallmark of ALF, ACLF. Okay, and we think, and we have now seen it now. In fact, we are now nearing 300 patients with plasma exchange. So it's increasingly we're seeing the benefit, and all over India is getting done. And luckily, in this lady also, she seemed to have done well.
Thank you. I think there's just one question from Dr. Jayendra. Dr. Jayendra, can you use the mic?
Sir, if a pregnant patient comes, she has pruritus, only no jaundice, and we get LFT, suspect ICP, and start UDCA. Is there any need for going for other tests also, like checking for AIH also and hepatitis B and all the tests done, or just the follow up with LFTs and see for the effect of UDCA?
Could you hear the question, Dr. Eapen?
I think I'll request Madhumita to bat it.
Yeah, Madhumita, please.
What I heard is that the patient who's diagnosed with ICP.
Yeah, pregnant lady, itching, UDCA given, response. Do we need to look for other causes of liver disease?
Well, if the patient has responded to UDCA and we have the bile acid level and there was definite pruritus, then I wouldn't investigate further unless there is a recurrence of the transaminitis or some other thing, or the appearance of jaundice. Then only we will need to investigate further. However, ICP is a diagnosis of exclusion. So we definitely do need to rule out viral hepatitis. For example, the cholestatic phase of viral hepatitis also bile acid levels might go up. So at the very least, one needs to look at viral hepatitis, B, C, A, and E. And one also needs to make sure that the bile acid levels are documented to be high and they have resolved with the addition of UDCA. Otherwise, we will never know. Sir, you can correct me if we need to look for autoimmune in every case.
No, I agree with you. I would go by one, the clinical presentation. This is cholestasis. And two, the LFT. If the LFT also is consistent with intrahepatic cholestasis, one, I want to make sure I'm not missing out a stone causing biliary obstruction, ultrasound, as well as it's fine to do viral hepatitis screen. Beyond that, I would not do AIH profile unless, let's say, enzymes are high. If OTPT is high, that's different. Otherwise, it's not logical. Bile acids is useful to do. It should be done in this scenario.
Thank you, Dr. Eapen. Thank you, Dr. Madhumita. And thank you to all our panelists and chairperson, especially Dr. Vanita Suri, for coming and discussing very vividly about how we should be managing these patients. And I really thank the gynecology department to have actively participated in this session. I'm sure this will foster more interaction across the two departments in managing these difficult patients. And thank you, Dr. Pankaj, for joining us, and Dr. Harjeet for joining us in this session. With this, and Dr. Atul Sachdev, who is there. Thank you, Dr. Sachdeva. And with this, we come to a close of this session, and we will, avoid this tea break so that we can catch up on that little time that we lost in some technical glitches.